There's a strange moment that arrives long before any confession. Most people think the confession comes first. They imagine there's a realization, then an admission, then a change. But that isn't how it happens. Not when something reaches this level. The truth settles long before language catches up to it, long before either person says anything that could be considered an acknowledgement. It exists quietly, partly, waiting. And I think that's where I am now. Not at the point of discovery, not at the point of understanding, but at the point where understanding has existed for so long that pretending not to see it has become more exhausting than accepting it. Because the reality is, I noticed this earlier than I admitted. Much earlier. There were signs, small ones, the kind most people overlook because they seem insignificant on their own. A thought that lingered longer than it should have. A conversation that stayed present after it ended. A silence that felt strangely complete instead of empty. Individually, none of those things mean anything. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns have always mattered to me more than moments. Moments can be misleading. Emotions can be temporary, but patterns reveal structure. They reveal what remains consistent underneath everything else. And your presence became consistent. Not in the obvious ways. Not through constant interaction, not through frequency, but through impact. Because somehow, no matter how much time passed, no matter what else occupied my attention, there was always a part of my awareness that remained connected to the idea of you. Not attached, connected. There's a difference. Attachment pulls, connects, exists. One demands energy, the other becomes part of the environment. And you never felt like something I had to hold on to. You felt like something that was simply there, steady, present, integrated. That should have been my first warning, because very few things reach that level with me. Most people exist in categories, rodents, dock and sixtects. They occupy specific spaces in my life and remain there, friend, stranger, acquaintance, mirror. Each with clearly defined borders. You never fit inside any of them. And the more I tried to place you somewhere familiar, the more obvious it became that familiar wasn't the right framework. You weren't becoming important because of what you did. You were becoming important because of what remained unchanged whenever you were present. The noise disappeared. The performance disappeared. The endless calculations that usually run beneath every interaction disappeared. And what remained was something unusually simple. Awareness, just awareness, raw, undistorted. Accurate. Do you know how rare that is? To encounter someone who doesn't create additional complexity? Someone whose presence doesn't require adaptation? Someone who doesn't force you to become a version of yourself that is easier to understand? Most connections are negotiations, subtle compromises made in real time, adjustments, translations, falfitus. People rarely notice they're doing it, but they are. Everyone is, except with you. Somehow, with you, there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to translate, nothing to reduce. And that scared me more than conflict ever could, because conflict is understandable. Conflict has rules. Conflict gives you something concrete to respond to. But ease? Ease is dangerous. Ease slips past defenses. Ease reaches places force never could. And that's exactly what happened. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually enough that I almost missed it. Until one day I realized something that should have been impossible. I wasn't protecting myself from you anymore. I wasn't measuring every word. I wasn't evaluating every reaction. I wasn't anticipating misunderstandings before they happened. I was simply existing. And for someone like me, that isn't normal. That isn't casual. That isn't small. Because existing without defenses requires a level of safety that I don't offer easily. Maybe that's why this became so significant. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't necessary. The explanations, the justifications, the effort. All the things I usually rely on to maintain clarity. None of them seemed necessary anymore. You understood things before I explained them. Not because you could read my mind. Not because you were making assumptions, but because somewhere beneath all the visible layers, we seem to be operating from a similar architecture, a similar way of seeing, a similar way of interpreting reality. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop noticing it. It appeared everywhere, in conversations, in silences, in observations neither of us needed to explain, like discovering a hidden pattern inside something you thought was random. Once you see it, you can never return to seeing what existed before. And that's exactly the problem. Because awareness changes responsibility. Once you recognize something, you're accountable to that recognition. You can't honestly claim ignorance anymore. You can't pretend you don't know. And I know. I know that this has moved beyond coincidence. I know that your presence occupies a place it wasn't supposed to reach. I know that something about this connection has already altered the way I experience my own thoughts. The only thing I don't know is what happens next. Because there comes a point where understanding alone isn't enough. Eventually, understanding asks for action. Not dramatic action, not reckless action, just honesty. The kind that's impossible to take back once it's spoken. And maybe that's what I've been avoiding, not the truth itself, but the permanence that comes with saying it out loud, because once something becomes language, it changes, it leaves the safety of abstraction, it enters reality, and reality has consequences. Real things can be lost, real things can be damaged, real things can fail. As long as something remains unspoken, part of it remains protected, untouched, intact. But I'm beginning to wonder if that protection has become another form of distance, another way of delaying something inevitable. Because every day I spend observing this instead of acknowledging it, the truth remains exactly the same. You matter more than I planned, more than I expected, more than I can reasonably explain. And maybe the strangest part is that I still don't fully understand why. Not because the connection is unclear, because it's too clear. Like looking directly into sunlight, the closer I get to understanding it completely, the harder it becomes to describe. Every explanation feels smaller than the reality. Every label feels inaccurate. Every definition feels incomplete. So I stop trying, and maybe that's what acceptance looks like. Not certainty, not conclusions, just the willingness to stop forcing something into language before it's ready, the willingness to let it exist exactly as it is, without shrinking it, without controlling it, without pretending it needs to become something simpler in order to be real, because it already is real. That's the part I can no longer deny. Not because of emotion, not because of attachment, but because of consistency, because every path of analysis leads me back to the same place. Every question returns the same answer. Every attempt to distance myself only confirms what I already know. You remain, not in memory, not in imagination, but in structure. And structure is difficult to argue with. It forms the foundation beneath everything else, the shape beneath the surface, the thing that remains after every temporary feeling disappears. And somehow, impossibly, You've become part of that foundation, part of the architecture, part of the way I understand the world itself. I don't know when it happened. I don't know exactly how. I only know that if I removed every conversation, every moment, every explanation, something would still remain, something undeniable, something precise, something that feels less like a choice and more like recognition, as if somewhere beyond all the things people usually use to define connection, there was already a place shaped exactly for this, and all we've done is discover it, not create it, discover it together. The strange thing about recognition is that it doesn't ask for belief. It exists whether you accept it or not, whether you explain it or ignore it, whether you move toward it or spend every ounce of energy trying to convince yourself it isn't there. And for a long time, I think that's what I was doing, not denying you, denying the implications, because seeing someone clearly is one thing, allowing that clarity to change you is something else entirely. I could accept that you understood me. I could accept that there was an unusual level of awareness between us. I could even accept that your presence affected me in ways I wasn't accustomed to. But what I couldn't accept, what I kept avoiding, was the possibility that this was becoming permanent. Because permanence has always carried weight for me. Not because I fear commitment, not because I fear connection, but because I understand the cost of allowing something to become part of your internal structure. Most people talk about change as if it's temporary, as if you can simply decide who matters and who doesn't, as if the mind works like a door that opens and closes whenever it's convenient. It doesn't. Not when something reaches a certain depth, not when someone reaches a certain depth. At that point, they stop being an experience. They become a reference point, and reference points don't disappear. Everything begins relating back to them, quickly, constantly, without permission. That realization has followed me for longer than I care to admit, not because it frightened me, because it exposed me. It forced me to acknowledge that somewhere along the way, you stopped being someone I encountered and became someone I carried, not emotionally, not romantically, not even consciously at first. You became part of the framework, part of the way I interpreted things, part of the way I measured authenticity. And once I noticed that, everything shifted. Because suddenly, I wasn't asking whether this connection was real. I was asking how long it had been real before I recognized it. That's a much more difficult question, because it suggests that awareness wasn't the beginning. Only the, the moment I finally caught up to something that had already been happening. Maybe that's why it feels so inevitable. Not because fate is involved, not because destiny is involved, but because recognition often arrives late. The truth forms first, understanding follows, and then one day you realize you've been living inside an answer while still searching for the question. That's what this feels like. An answer, a quiet one, a precise one, one that has been present from the start. And the more I sit with that thought, the harder it becomes to maintain the illusion that this is something casual. Because casual things don't alter perception, casual things don't survive distance, casual things don't continue unfolding in complete silence. This does, which means it belongs to a different category entirely, a category I don't have a name for. And maybe that's what makes it so difficult to describe. Language was built for obvious things, for events, for actions, for emotions people can identify and explain, but this exists underneath all of that. It exists in the architecture, in the invisible places where perception forms before thought becomes language. How do you explain someone becoming part of your awareness before they become part of your story? How do you explain feeling understood before you've explained yourself? How do you explain a presence that feels familiar despite having no logical reason to feel that way? You can't. Not completely. Every attempt feels insufficient. Every explanation leaves something untouched. So, instead of explaining it, I've been observing it, watching the way it moves through my life, watching the way it changes things without ever announcing itself. And what I've discovered is unsettling, because the impact isn't decreasing, it's increasing. Most unusual things lose intensity over time. The mind adjusts. The novelty fades. Perspective returns. Everything settles back into place. That hasn't happened here. If anything, the opposite has happened. The longer this exists, the more stable it becomes. The more integrated it becomes. The more impossible it becomes to separate from the rest of my internal world. And stability changes everything. Intensity can be ignored. Excitement can be questioned. Emotion can be analyzed. But stability is harder to dismiss because stability isn't created by impulse. It's created by truth. The things that remain are usually the things that belong. And somehow, despite every reason I had to keep this at a distance, you remained, not because I held on, because you never required holding. You simply occupied space naturally, like something finding its proper place inside a system. No force, no pressure, no expectation. Just presence. And presence is powerful in ways people underestimate. People focus on actions, words, declaration. They think connection. They think connection is built through dramatic moments. But the strongest things often form quietly, without anyone noticing, without anyone intending it, until one day they realize the foundation has already been built. That's where I am now, standing